You're with me, Ed Stott, on That's Helpful. Welcome if you're joining me for the first time. Don't forget to subscribe for your weekly dose of science-backed self-improvement. Now, so many of us expect to become less happy as we age, for opportunities to dry up, pessimism to set in, and for our excitement around life to drift away. But science says you couldn't be more wrong. You'll likely become happier as you get into old age. You'll be more content and more able to live in the present moment. This phenomenon is called the happiness curve, and it's a concept that award-winning journalist Jonathon Rauch is incredibly passionate about. Jonathon is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington and the author of The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50. So what does the research say? How can we avoid the midlife crisis we hear so much about? And how might the happiness curve actually help us to reframe the way we approach aging? Jonathon, thank you so much for joining me. Tell me, what was it that led you to discover the happiness curve in the first place?
Well, I can tell you how I discovered it in my life. I can't claim to have discovered the science. That was done by smarter people than me. But when I got into my late 30s, I began to notice vague and unattributable feelings of disappointment, dissatisfaction, restlessness. I took note of this, but I assumed that it would pass because I was having a very successful career. I was involved in a successful relationship, long-term, probably my first. I was healthy. I had nothing to complain about. Yet with each passing year, this sense of this funk seemed to deepen. My discontent deepened. I would hear sort of voices, especially in mornings. It was especially bad, saying that I was wasting my life and I should do something entirely different. And I knew this to be irrational. I realized how serious it had become when at age 45, unexpectedly, I won the highest journalism award in my industry, the National Magazine Award. It's the equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize in the United States for magazine writing. I won that. Well, thank goodness that turned me around and I felt that sense of elusive life satisfaction for about 8 days. And then the demons came right back. And that's when I realized I was up against something irrational. And I was worried about it. I was alarmed by it. I thought maybe I was going to be depressed forever or dissatisfied at least forever. It's not really depression. It's not an emotional disorder. It's more a discontentment. Then around 50, things really did start to go south. Both my parents died, both in unpleasant ways, and my job went away and so forth. Yet I also noticed this fog beginning to lift. That was odd. Okay, so right around the same time, I talked to an economist who studies happiness research and told me about the U-shaped curve. And I said, what's that? And she said, well, other things being equal, it turns out that aging is not a neutral process where life satisfaction is concerned. In huge data sets in countries and cultures all over the world, again and again, we see that midlife is difficult. Not necessarily a crisis, but that things like discontent and frustration grow, and actually indicators like depression and suicide tend to go up in midlife. And even more weirdly, this comes out independently of other variables. It's not attributable to things going on in your life at midlife, like your kids or your job or your aging parents. It's independent. It's after you factor out all those things, aging itself has this weird effect. And that's when the light bulb went on, Ed. And I just thought, well, that describes my life and it describes the strangeness of the experience. So I wrote The Happiness Curve as the user manual for everything I wish I had known when I was 40 and headed into that stormy weather.
And so the research is quite remarkable. The way that these economists looked into the U-shaped curve is pretty amazing. And it offers us quite incredible insights into how the U curve plays out from country to country, right? Can you tell me about what they observed in each country?
Well, no, because there's so much data for so many countries. This data sets go back to the 90s and even before, 149 countries around the world. And I tend to focus on what they have in common, which is that the U-shaped curve shows up all over the place. Now, here we get into the weeds, and you probably don't want to do that. Mm-hmm. But happiness is at different levels in different countries. So that U-shaped curve can be in a high place in Scandinavia and in a low place in Russia. One of the things you learn from global happiness comparisons is don't be Russian. And the bottom of the curve, the age at which people bottom out and then things start to improve, that also depends on the country and culture. In some countries, it's earlier, which means that's actually better because you have more years ahead of you when you're on the upswing and getting happier. So all of those things vary by country, but the basic pattern now is pretty well established that there is this tendency of aging to make it harder to feel satisfied with life in midlife and then easier after that. And, okay, so Ed, here's when I knew that we were into something really pretty fundamental. In 2012, research was done finding the same phenomenon among chimps and orangutans.
Wild.
There are ways to gauge pretty accurately their level of satisfaction, both by their physical health and their demeanor, and zookeepers and keepers keep very careful records. And it turned out this appears to be a cross-primate phenomenon that has to do with rewiring of the brain and changing of values as we get older, changing of what our priorities are in the group.
Honestly, it's absolutely astounding, and it's wild that more of us don't know about this because it can really change the way we view aging. Tell me, what explains this slump that so many of us experience?
Well, no one knows for sure. It's easy to say the what, because there's so much data now confirming the U-shaped life satisfaction curve. The how is really hard. I think the best conjecture that I've seen, my own view, is that it's a perfect storm of three things that are happening at once. One of them, which is the hardest to explain, but the weirdest and most interesting and crazy, is what economists call a forecasting error. The happiness curve was discovered by economists, not psychologists, which kind of makes it interesting. So what's a forecasting error? Well, imagine that you move to Seattle, Washington, at age 22, expecting lots of sunshine. And first 5 years, you're not seeing much sunshine. You're seeing a lot of rain, but you think, well, next year will be sunny. Well, 15, 20 years, by your late 30s, early 40s, you start to realize that the actual situation does not match your expectations. And that builds up over time. That becomes kind of depressing until eventually you recalibrate your expectations and realize, okay, I got the forecast wrong. It's not going to be sunny here. I'm going to look for other ways to enjoy the environment. Well, that's kind of an analogy for what happens. We think when we're young that if we score all of those social goals in life we have, the career and the life partner and the house and maybe the kids and the car and whatever else, that's going to make us satisfied with life. Except it doesn't. Because ambition's a trickster. It wants us to keep going. So it just moves the goalposts. Every time we achieve one of these things, it goes right into our pocket. We're on to the next thing. Well, for the first 5 years, you think, okay, well, maybe this job didn't do it, but the next one will. But by your 40s, you're thinking, my God, I'll never be happy. And then as you get into your 50s and beyond, you become aware of the situation, you recalibrate, you become realistic, and that turns out to be very good for happiness. So that's the first thing. The second or third, much easier to explain. The second is as we age, we change our priorities. we know that life is getting shorter, and we tend to move away from competition and achievement-oriented goals to cooperation and community goals. We tend to invest more in the people and relationships we care more about because we don't have as much time with them. And that happens automatically, subconsciously as well. And it turns out, unlike ambition, investing in your core relationships and your community is a way to achieve lasting life satisfaction. It does not move the goalposts. So as our values realign in later life, we find that leads to an increase in life satisfaction, but there is this transition along the way when we have to recalibrate. Ambition is no longer rewarding, but our values haven't fully made the transition to the next thing yet, and we call that our 40s. Third thing that happens, our brains change. It's just that simple. We are humans, one of only a small handful of species in which the females outlive by 30 or 40 years our reproductive years. That's thought to be because of what's called the grandmother effect, which is having those elders around with their wisdom and their nurturing and their skills and experience improves the outlook for their kids and their grandkids. So nature keeps us around. And it seems like what nature is doing also with men, not just women, is rewiring our actual brains as we get older so that we are more oriented toward mentoring, coaching, community service, children, grandchildren, teaching, giving back. And as we age, our brains become less reactive to the negative things in life. You know, gosh darn it, I didn't get that job. Or gosh darn it, look at this traffic. And our brains actually become more responsive to the positive aspects of life. We taste the sweet more and the sour less. And that's documented by brain scans. So as we age, our brains actually change in ways that make it easier for us to feel satisfied in life. When you add those three things up, you get this distinct tendency to have this rough patch in midlife. And here's the thing. There's a pot of gold at the end of this rainbow. What's happening in midlife is not just a slump, it's a transition to a time in life, late adulthood, the most pro-social and satisfying time of life, when we're more oriented to the things that give us and the people around us most satisfaction. So there is a payoff, but it's like traveling through adolescence. Adolescence is hard for a lot of people, but we understand it's part of a transition in life that's beneficial. The bottom of the happiness curve is like that too. And by the way, I'm about to be 64, and that's how it's played out for me as well.
Yeah, incredible. I was talking to my husband about this and explaining, because I was really excited about the interview and the concept because I'd never heard about it before. And he said to me, yeah, well, that is what everyone says, right? Everyone does say that post 50, they feel much happier, much more content, much more like they know themselves. It's fantastic. Yet this transitional period can be so turbulent for so many of us. One of the things that you said when you were experiencing it was that you felt a bit embarrassed that you were feeling it, and that made you bottle it up and not want to talk about it. How did that make things worse when you were going through this time of transition?
I got so much wrong, Ed. That's why I wrote this book, really. So I knew that I was the most fortunate person on the planet in my 40s. I was engaged in a richly rewarding career, and I was getting positive reinforcement, and I was in a successful relationship, which I had never even thought would be possible for me, and on. Yet I couldn't feel grateful about it. I began to feel shame at the fact that I did not feel the gratitude that I felt was morally justified. I began to feel like some kind of grouch. So I didn't want to tell people about this. I had so much to be positive about. Why was I feeling this way? So I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. I felt there was something immoral. And also I didn't want to be judged as having a midlife crisis. What I was having was not depression. It didn't feel like I needed to be on drugs. I was perfectly functional, getting out of bed, doing all the things I was doing. They just didn't seem to be as satisfying as as they should be. But I didn't want people to say, oh, you must be having your midlife crisis. When are you going to get the sports car? So we tend to isolate people in their 40s, and we tend to isolate ourselves because 40s and early 50s, that's when we're supposed to be masters of the universe. The narrative is we're in our peak health. We've launched our careers. We've got our kids. If we have kids, we've got parents to take care of. We're supposed to be gods, supermen and superwomen. And it's not respectable to say, you know what, this is a time of vulnerability for me. I don't know if I really still care about the things that I thought I cared about. I think the things I do every day don't give me the satisfaction that I expected. Keeping these things inside, not talking about them, not getting support is about the worst thing you can do. And the second worst thing you can do is pathologize yourself and imagine there's something terribly wrong with me. I'll never feel grateful or happy again. So both of those things happened to me, and both of them made it much worse. If I had known that what I was experiencing was perfectly normal, naturally, and completely healthy if properly managed, it would have removed those layers of worry. And if society around me had not had this myth of the midlife crisis when we behave irresponsibly and we throw away our jobs and we act like fools and children, I would not have felt embarrassed about telling the people I was closest to, I'm having these weird feelings. Mm-hmm. And if society changes the narrative from we're all supposed to be supermen and women in our 40s to, this could be rough, and we get that, and we have your back, then we're in a world where suddenly we're not feeling ashamed, we're not talking, we're instead moving through this together with the social support for each other that we need. And I tell people, if you're not experiencing this midlife malaise, and some people don't, it varies by individual, someone in your life certainly is, family member, a friend. If you catch on to that, be there for them. Don't make stupid jokes about it, or don't just assume that everything's okay. Understand that it's normal and natural, but reach out and be a friend.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because in actual fact, if we reframe this in our own minds and as a society, this time of life is actually ripe for a relaunch, right?
Yes. So in the book, I have 6 strategies for getting through this and avoiding the mistakes that I made. And I tried to stay away from the generic stuff like, exercise and eat well, and focus on the specific things that will work against this specific syndrome. And one of them is, we can talk about more of them if you like, but one of them is step, don't leap. So part of what's happening in this period is our values are changing. As we said earlier, we're moving away from the competitive achievement, social climbing type of values to the more cooperative, community-oriented values. And that's going to mean for many people that what they've been doing for their lives, for their careers, their jobs, other things, no longer feels as right to them. It's no longer as in touch with their values. So it is important to make change. Just because you're feeling midlife malaise doesn't mean you don't need change, but do it carefully. Step, don't leap. Life coaches are great, I think. A really good model for dealing with this because they don't pathologize it. They're not going to say, what's wrong with you? How do we fix you? They're going to say, what's right with you? And how do we realign your life with your values? How do we sort out the things that you do and don't care about and figure out where to go next? It's a great model because it's built on alliance. And another thing to do, be careful about throwing all the cards up into the air, starting over. Resist those temptations. Involve other people in your plans as you begin to reconsider what you'd like to do next. Consult widely. Build on your networks and skills, all the social capital you've accumulated. Have a plan B in case plan A doesn't work out. That's what I mean by step, don't leap. But if you do that, the 40s and 50s are a wonderful time to begin relaunching, repurposing. I didn't know this till I wrote the book, Ed, but more people launch startups in the United States in their 50s than in their 20s.
Wow.
Isn't that wonderful?
Amazing. So I just love it because it's such an optimistic way to reframe aging. And it's not like, we're painting a plaster over it and going, oh, it's actually great. This is evidence-backed research that, is undeniable. It's wonderful. What are the other things you talk about in terms of the strategy of dealing with this little slump is to make sure that we take control of our inner critic? How have you managed to do that, and why is this so important in particular?
Well, I haven't managed to take control of it, and that's never completely possible.
That's very
And I'm not sure
reassuring.
I'd want it to be. But what I did do is engage in a kind of bargain basement cognitive behavioral therapy. So CBT is, excuse me,
Okay.
what CBT does is it tries to change those tapes that run through your mind that tell you you're ugly, you're fat, you're unpopular, and those things can become spirals. They can become obsessions. And they teach us to replace those tapes with other tapes that are more based in reality and truth. So what I started doing, it seems kind of brainless and simple, but it was helpful, is when I caught my mind drifting in one of these loops, which I would get, which would tell me, John, you're wasting your life. Or, John, why haven't you been on TV like your friends who are doing? I would catch that beginning of that thought and I would interrupt it with a phrase. One of the phrases I used was when I started getting into status comparisons, which it's easy to dwell on, I would interrupt that with the phrase, no comparison. I'd just stop it. I'd say no comparison. And then if the thought cycle came back again, a minute or two later, I would say no comparison again. And this actually, it's not the whole story. Nothing is. If you're headed into one of these slumps, you can't completely avoid it, and you wouldn't want to because it's something you need to go through. But that kind of strategy helped cut off some of these thought spirals. Another one that I used that I found useful in my case was, I don't have to be perfect today. So when I started to lacerate myself inwardly about something that I had gotten wrong or that could have been better or should have been better, I would cut that off with the inner phrase, I don't have to be perfect today. And you do your own. I'm not saying those particular phrases are what work for you, but I'm saying that just getting myself into the habit of interrupting the negative thought spirals turned out to be very helpful.
Mm. Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because that self-compassion, we hear it time and time again. But again, it's something that is science-backed. It's going to help, and it makes you more productive because you're not permanently beating yourself up. Are there any other things that can help us to get through this transition period? Maybe not let it last for as long as it might.
Yes. Well, I mentioned reach out.
Prepare ourselves for it. Yeah, go on. Sorry.
I mentioned reach out. Don't let yourself get isolated. That's important. Yeah. Mindfulness seems to help. So the happiness curve is a time trap when you think about it. What it really is you're disappointed in your past, and that makes you pessimistic about your future. Mm. One way to reduce that effect is to stay in the present. To reduce the amount in which you're dwelling on what you have or have not accomplished or achieved, and reduce the amount in which you're thinking about how long do you have left and how can you make sure you maximize every hour, and just stay here now. So meditation works for a lot of people. I'm not a meditator, but I have used long sessions listening to classical music, for example, as one way to try to keep myself here. And more to the point, mindfulness generally is very good for health, and it's also helpful for escaping the time trap. Mm. You ask about a way to prepare for this. So there are two super valuable things that everyone can do. The first one, I could summarize it as saying, read my book, but that would be a little self-serving. So I'll put it a different way, which is just knowing that midlife is a time of adjustment and vulnerability and often malaise and discontent. And knowing that that's normal, natural, and healthy if properly managed, that will reduce its impact on you because it will reduce the amount of fear and moral panic that you're feeling. So making yourself aware of the happiness curve, forewarned is forearmed, or making other people aware of the happiness curve is also helpful. Second thing that is just super, super useful to know, it ends. The way this thing is designed, the way this logic works, you never see the end of the tunnel coming, but it does come. Everyone comes out of this sooner or later. And if you wait, time is on your side. What's happening here is that the current of the river of life satisfaction, which works against us in our late 30s and into our 40s, is reversing. And that current of aging will help you feel more satisfaction into your 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, even into your 90s. So use that time, be patient, don't panic, wait.
So useful. And so how do you hope that, people learning about the happiness curve will shift our perspective on aging and even help to reduce ageism too?
Ageism is such a huge factor. So something I just bang away at in my book, Ed, is so far we've been talking about this at the individual level. But the happiness curve, midlife malaise, is a social syndrome. A lot of it has to do with this false narrative that we have that midlife, we're supposed to be at the peak of our powers. And if you're not, you're having a midlife crisis or you're depressed or pathological. And this notion that once you get to 50 and 60, your life is going to be gloom because you're just going to get old and decrepit and you're going to be cast aside by society and you'll become grouchy and miserable. And that, of course, makes us even more pessimistic in middle age. What needs to happen so urgently is to update the social narrative so that it matches the science. And here's what the science tells you. This is why I so love talking about this topic. It is unadulterated, 100% good news. I would argue, you tell me if I'm exaggerating, but I would argue that our generation, specifically your generation, is receiving the greatest gift in the entire history of the human species. And that's an additional 5, 10, ultimately maybe 15 or 20 years of additional life in late adulthood, which is the most satisfying and pro-social part of life. I mean, imagine that. And imagine what people can do with those productive, vibrant years in their late 60s and on into their 70s, and it's going to be 80s and 90s. When no, most of them will not have dementia. Most of them will not have multiple chronic conditions that keep them at home. No, it is not true that creativity ends in your 50s. In fact, it's proven that in workplaces, multi-generational teams are more productive, more creative, and more satisfying than teams of just young people or just old people. We have the opportunity to put the skills, the experience, and the pro-social orientation of late adulthood to work in our societies as never before. But to do that, we're going to have to get rid of the story that after 65 or whatever, you're old, you're retired, you're going to be put out to pasture until you get depressed, diseased, and die. We need to reinvent jobs so that there are what are called less hard jobs, so that instead of retirement cliffs where all of a sudden you go from working hard to not working at all, to off-ramps so that people can shift as they age toward things like mentoring, training, bringing teams together. We need to reappreciate and revalue the wisdom that people who are older bring. This requires a whole social mindset. Ageism is possibly the single most common form of discrimination in the world. It's observed in people as young as what we call third and fourth grade. That would be 8 and 9 years old. stereotypes of old people. It persists everywhere in the developed world, not necessarily in the East, which has a much more high esteem for older age. But this form of discrimination is throwing away huge amounts of talent and making us miserable.
Absolutely. It's so interesting, and it's so wonderful to read the book and hear you speak, because it does make me so optimistic. You know, I feel like I'm in a bit of a transitional period in my own life at the moment. You know, people will be bored about hearing me bang on about this, but I am pretty pregnant at the moment. So I feel like
congratulations.
Thank you so much. I'm 31 weeks this week. I was reading, me and my friend were talking about this, and she discovered this term called matrescence. And it's like the adolescence of heading into motherhood. And I think if we can acknowledge these transitional periods in our lives much more, you know, like you say, we do recognize it for teenagers, and, you know, it's like, oh, cut them a bit of slack. It's a big change, you know, be a bit kinder, nurture them. If we could kind of take that approach and apply that to other areas of our lives, it does strike me that we would all be much happier, much kinder to ourselves, and get much more done.
The point you make is so important, Ed, because think about the teenage years. We surround teenagers with guardrails and advisors, guardians, because we understand that this is a stressful part of life when important changes are happening. So they have the churches, the clubs, the schools, the teachers, the many mentors. They have the various commemorations that mark their paths, bar mitzvah, graduations, several levels. We do nothing like those things in midlife. We leave people entirely on their own. There's really, apart from marriage, between college graduation, if you went to college, and retirement parties, there's very little we do for people to mark the milestones in their lives, and very little that we do that provides guidance for them. We should make it possible. Just for example, there are many proposals, but we should make it possible in the United States, where we have a public pension system, to take a year's worth of your public pension benefits out of the future and use it in your 40s or 50s for a year of retraining to go back to school. Yeah. We should have gap years for people in middle age. They're rethinking their lives in many cases. They're changing their values. Maybe they need some time off to do that. We should have institutional ways, continuing education programs, all kinds of ways for people going through these transitions to get the resources that they need. We shouldn't be required to do this on our own.
No, and even if you're fortunate or privileged enough to be able to do that for yourself, like you say, take a year out or, you know, go back and restudy, a lot of those things, we often view them as quite indulgent and, you know, a bit like, you know, just like we're languishing in it, and we're not really trying, we're giving up. Whereas if we understand this a bit more and reframe it, there's real value in taking that time to assess and shift.
Yes, exactly. We stigmatize efforts to come to new values in midlife, and it should be the opposite. There are interesting programs now and sprouting up in all kinds of places that are thinking in new ways about education, for example. It's crazy that we pack all of education into roughly more or less the first 20 years of life, and then go the rest of our lives without, leaving it completely up to individuals to do further education. That's just nuts, right? Our societies, our cultures should be wired so that, of course, we'll go back to school in middle age. Of course, we'll be reinventing ourselves. There need to be more ways and programs to teach us entrepreneurship in middle age. In America, I don't know about down under, but in the United States, you know, there's this huge culture of youth entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
This adulation of, 20-somethings who start Facebook or what have you. We don't really have public models for the many, many people who start new businesses and programs and nonprofits, especially. in midlife.
It's so true. And, we see these lists of, 30 under 30 and, highest young achiever and all those kinds of things. Like, I don't know, it just further backs up that worldview that only young people deserve accolades for pushing boundaries and reshifting and rethinking things, when in actual fact, it's something we should all be encouraged to do. On a personal level, what has the research taught you about what truly brings life satisfaction, and what perhaps we might be better focusing on earlier in our lives, rather than leaving it until these 40s and 50s and letting it reshift?
Well, nothing will or probably should change the fact that young people are ambitious and focus on getting established in life and developing some status, because Charles Darwin tells us that having high status equals mating opportunities, and that means we pass on our genes. So let's not pretend that a 25-year-old and a 65-year-old will ever have the same outlook on life. So that's one caveat. And here's a second caveat. I should have said this right at the outset, but it's important to remember there are two kinds of happiness that people talk about. And one is called affective happiness, and that's your mood. You get at that, you asking people questions like, how often did you smile today? Did you feel anxious yesterday? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something quite different, which is known as evaluative happiness. And that's gotten at with questions like, how fulfilled do you feel in your life? Or classic version, on a scale of 1 to 10, how great would you say, how much satisfaction do you take in your life? And these things are very different, and people are keeping them apart. And what we're talking about in this conversation is evaluative happiness, which turns out to be more important for most people. People can suffer through times of stress, anxiety, and depression if they feel that they're doing something satisfying along the way, serving their countries, creating a family, and so forth. So evaluative happiness, can we bring it forward? The answer is, despite everything that I said about ambition and it's wired into us, study after study shows that if you want lasting satisfaction in life, the most important thing is to be connected to a community of people who care about you and who you care about. And that's true at any age. This is better for your life satisfaction, but it's also better for your physical health. So taking care of those relationships, nurturing them, finding ways to volunteer, to give back to your community, mentoring, all of these things are good at any stage of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if we only remember one thing about the happiness curve, if we only take one thing away from this conversation, what do you want people to remember?
Don't panic. Many people, not everyone, but many people will hit an emotional slump, a turbulence in midlife. There's absolutely nothing wrong with you. And there is a pot of gold there at the end of this rainbow.
My guest today was Jonathon Rauch. Jonathon is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington and the author of The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50. I'm going to put a link to Jonathon's book and where you can find his work in the show notes. I just love an optimistic episode on something that you've previously been terrified about or have thought of as not very nice and avoided, because that's absolutely been my attitude. So I hope you found it helpful too. If you have, please leave me a review wherever you're listening. It genuinely helps other people find our little self-improvement club, and I really, really appreciate them. It's just me and my little microphone, and you can sometimes feel like you're shouting into the void, but I know you're out there. But reading your reviews just brings me joy, and on those days where I think, Ed, what are you doing? Reading those reviews just brings me so much confidence and makes me feel like I'm bringing something useful and helpful to the world. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining me. I love having these chats with you guys every week. And it's just such a joy to be able to share such cool conversations and get amazing people to have a chat with us and help us iron out some of life's trickiest kinks. So I'm thrilled to have you here. I'm Ed Stott, and I sincerely hope that's helpful.